I stood there watching 2,000 pounds of angry bull charge straight into Sheriff Karen's fancy police department party. Tables flew. Decorations scattered like confetti in a tornado. Deputies scrambled over each other, diving behind overturned chairs as my prize Angus bulls reclaimed what was rightfully mine. Karen's face went white as she pressed herself against the barn wall, her badge and authority meaning absolutely nothing to these massive animals. That was the moment I realized sometimes justice comes with hooves instead of gavels, and sometimes you have to lock the door behind it. My name is Tom Mitchell, and I have spent the last 15 years building something beautiful on this patch of Wyoming land. Every morning at 5:30, I would walk out to check on my cattle, breathing in the crisp mountain air that still carried the scent of yesterday's rain. The barn I built with my own hands stood like a cathedral in the center of my property, its red paint gleaming in the sunrise. Inside that barn lived my pride and joy. 6 Angus bulls, each weighing over 2,000 pounds, each worth more than most people's cars. I had raised them from calves, watched them grow into magnificent beasts that commanded respect from every rancher in 3 counties. Their names were simple but fitting: Thunder, Storm, Rebel, Titan, Goliath, and King. They knew my voice, trusted my hands, and had never given me a moment's trouble. My property stretched across 47 acres of the most beautiful land God ever created. Rolling hills covered in buffalo grass, a creek that ran clear and cold even in August, and fence lines that I had walked and repaired 1,000 times. This was not just my home. This was my legacy, my retirement, my life's work made manifest in timber and steel and honest sweat. That was before Sheriff Karen Blackwood arrived in our quiet town of Cedar Falls. She transferred in from some big city department, bringing with her an attitude that rubbed everyone the wrong way from day one. Karen was the kind of woman who wore her badge like a crown and her uniform like armor. She had cold blue eyes that never seemed to blink and a smile that never reached them. The first time I met her, she was driving slowly past my property in her patrol car, windows down, taking pictures with her phone. I walked over to the fence line, curious about what had caught her attention. She rolled down her window and looked me up and down like she was sizing up a suspect. "Nice spread you have here," she said, her voice carrying the hint of an accent I could not place. "Must be worth a pretty penny." "It is home," I replied, keeping my tone friendly. "Been in my family for 3 generations." She nodded slowly, her eyes scanning the barn, the pastures, the house. "I am Sheriff Blackwood, just getting to know the area, meeting the important landowners." Something about the way she said "important landowners" made my skin crawl, like she was already calculating how to use that information. But I pushed the feeling aside. Maybe I was just being paranoid about the new sheriff in town. "Well, welcome to Cedar Falls," I said. "If you ever need anything, you know where to find me." She smiled that cold smile and drove away, but not before taking one more long look at my barn. I should have trusted my instincts that day. Should have known that Sheriff Karen Blackwood was going to be trouble. 3 weeks later, Sheriff Karen showed up at my front door with a request that made my blood run cold. She wanted to use my barn for the annual police department appreciation dinner. Not asked. Wanted. Like it was already decided and she was just being polite by informing me. "Your barn would be perfect for our event," she said, standing on my porch with her hands on her hips. "We need space for about 50 people, and that building of yours has character. Real, authentic Western atmosphere." I stood there for a moment, trying to process what I was hearing. "Sheriff, I appreciate the compliment, but that barn houses my livestock. My bulls are worth more than most people make in a year. I cannot just move them out for a party." Her expression changed. The fake friendliness disappeared, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. "Mr. Mitchell, I am not talking about some college keg party. This is an official police department function, a chance for the community to show appreciation for the men and women who protect them every day." "I understand that," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But the answer is still no. The barn is not available." She stepped closer, close enough that I could smell her perfume mixed with the scent of gun, oil, and leather. "You know, I have been driving around this county, and I have noticed a lot of code violations. Fences that might not meet county standards. Septic systems that probably have not been inspected in years. Livestock facilities that might not be up to current regulations." The threat was clear as daylight. Comply, or she would make my life a living hell with inspections and citations, and all the petty tyrannies that a corrupt sheriff could impose on a citizen who refused to bow down. "Are you threatening me, Sheriff?" "I am educating you, Mr. Mitchell, about the responsibilities that come with being a good neighbor and a law-abiding citizen in my county." After she left, I called my neighbor Jim Bradley, who owned the spread next to mine. Jim had been ranching longer than I had been alive, and he knew every dirty trick in the book when it came to dealing with corrupt officials. "Tom, you are not the first person she has tried this with," Jim told me over the phone. "She pressured the Hendersons into letting her use their pond for some kind of department fishing tournament, told them it was voluntary, but made it clear what would happen if they refused." "What did they do?" "What could they do? They said yes, and she turned their property into a circus for a weekend. Left trash everywhere, damaged their dock, scared their horses half to death with loud music and boat engines." I hung up the phone feeling sick to my stomach. This was not about community appreciation or police relations. This was about power. About a sheriff who thought her badge gave her the right to treat private property like her personal playground. Over the next few days, Sheriff Karen drove past my property more often than any patrol route would require. She would slow down, sometimes stop, always watching, always taking pictures, always making sure I knew she was there. I started sleeping poorly, jumping at every sound outside my window. The bulls sensed my tension and became restless, packing in their pen and snorting at shadows. Even they knew something was wrong. One evening, I found myself standing at the fence line, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. This was my sanctuary, my peace, my reward for a lifetime of hard work. But Sheriff Karen Blackwood was determined to take it away from me, one threat at a time. I made a decision that night. I would not be bullied. I would not surrender my property to satisfy some corrupt sheriff's power trip. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, I would fight back. Sheriff Karen returned exactly 1 week later, but this time she was not alone. She brought Deputy Martinez and Deputy Thompson, along with a clipboard full of official-looking papers that she waved around like they were court orders from the Supreme Court. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying the false authority of someone who had practiced this speech in the mirror, "I have here a temporary use permit signed by the county commissioner. Your barn has been designated as a community resource for law enforcement appreciation activities." I looked at the paper she shoved into my hands. The language was confusing, full of legal terminology that sounded important but felt wrong. References to eminent domain, public safety, community cooperation. But something about the signatures looked off. The dates were inconsistent. The letterhead seemed too crisp, too new. "This does not look legitimate," I said, studying the documents more carefully. "Are you questioning the authority of the county commissioner?" Her voice rose an octave, the way it does when someone is lying and getting defensive about it. Are you questioning the authority of the sheriff's department? Deputy Martinez shifted uncomfortably. He was a local boy, grew up here, knew right from wrong. I could see in his eyes that he was not comfortable with what was happening, but he was also young, needed his job, and was not about to challenge his superior over some rancher's property dispute. I want to call the county office and verify these documents, I said. The county office is closed for the weekend, Sheriff Karen replied with that cold smile. But you are welcome to call them Monday morning. Of course, our event is Saturday evening, so any verification would be too late to matter. She walked past me toward the barn like she owned the place. The deputies followed, keeping their eyes down, refusing to meet my gaze. I felt violated, helpless, and furious all at the same time. The event will begin at 6 p.m. Saturday, she called over her shoulder. We will need access to the barn starting at noon for setup. I trust you will have your livestock relocated to a safe distance. Where exactly am I supposed to relocate 6 2,000-pound bulls? That is not my problem, Mr. Mitchell. That is yours. I watched them walk around my property like they were surveying it for purchase, taking measurements, pointing at electrical outlets, discussing where to put tables and decorations. My bulls watched from their pen, snorting and pawing the ground. They could sense the tension, the wrongness of strangers treating their home like it belonged to someone else. That night, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee and tried to figure out my options. I could call a lawyer, but that would take time I did not have. I could contact the state police, but they would probably defer to local authority. I could refuse to comply and let them arrest me, but that would not save my barn or my bulls. Or I could do something else entirely. Something that would teach Sheriff Karen Blackwood that power cuts both ways, and sometimes the person with the most to lose is the one with the least to fear. I walked out to the bullpen and looked at my animals. Thunder, the biggest of them all, raised his massive head and looked back at me. These bulls had been raised by hand, fed by hand, cared for by hand. They knew me as their provider and protector, but they were still wild animals at heart, still creatures of instinct and territorial rage when threatened. An idea began forming in my mind. A terrible, beautiful, perfect idea. Saturday morning arrived gray and cloudy, with the smell of rain in the air. Sheriff Karen and her crew showed up at 11:30, half an hour early, probably hopping to catch me off guard. They brought folding tables, chairs, decorations, and a sound system that could have powered a rock concert. I stood by my kitchen window and watched them transform my barn into their personal party venue. Watched them hang streamers from the rafters where my grandfather's old tools used to hang. Watched them set up a bar in the corner where I stored grain and hay. By 5:30, the guests were arriving. Off-duty deputies, county officials, local business owners who wanted to stay on the sheriff's good side. They parked their cars all over my property, trampled my grass, and treated my land like it was public property. Sheriff Karen stood in the doorway of my barn, greeting her guests like she was the hostess of her own estate. She wore a black dress instead of her uniform, but she still carried herself with that same arrogant authority that made my skin crawl. The party was in full swing by 6:15. Music echoing across my property, laughter and conversation mixing with the sound of clinking glasses and scraping chairs. My bulls paced restlessly in their pen, agitated by the noise and the crowd of strangers who had invaded their territory. I waited until 7 o'clock, when the party was at its peak, and everyone was distracted by food and alcohol and the sound of their own voices. Then I walked out to the bull pen, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. "Sorry, boys," I whispered to my bulls, but it is time to take back what is ours. After Sheriff Corinne and her crew left that night, I spent hours walking my property and thinking about what had just happened. The violation was complete, the message clear. My barn was no longer mine to control. My land was no longer private. My rights as a citizen had been trampled under the boots of a corrupt sheriff who thought her badge made her a queen. But I was not going to roll over and play dead. I was going to fight back, and I was going to win. The next morning, I drove into town and met with Bill Crawford, the only lawyer in Cedar Falls who was not afraid of making enemies. Bill was 73 years old, tough as leather, and had been fighting bullies his entire career. "Tom, I am going to be straight with you," he said after I explained the situation. "Those documents Corinne showed you are forgeries. The county commissioner never signed anything giving her the right to use your property, but proving that in court would take months and cost you more money than you probably have. So she gets away with it." "She gets away with it this time," Bill said. "But every bully eventually pushes the wrong person too far, and when that happens, they usually push back hard." I left Bill's office with a clearer understanding of my situation. The legal system was not going to help me. The county officials were either in Sheriff Corinne's pocket or too afraid of her to stand up. I was on my own. That afternoon, I called Jim Bradley and asked him to come over for coffee. Jim arrived with his own stories about Sheriff Corinne's reign of terror. She had pressured the Millers into letting her use their pasture for a department training exercise. She had forced the Johnsons to provide free meals for her deputies during a supposed crime scene investigation that turned out to be nothing more than a way to get free food. "The woman is drunk on power," Jim said, shaking his head, "and nobody has the guts to stand up to her. Maybe it is time somebody did." Jim looked at me carefully. "What are you thinking, Tom?" I did not answer directly. Instead, I walked him out to the bullpen and showed him my animals. Thunder was standing near the fence, his massive head lowered, watching us with intelligent brown eyes. At 2,500 pounds, he was the largest bull I had ever owned, and the most unpredictable. "You know what I have been thinking about," I said to Jim. "I have been thinking about what happens when you put a bunch of strangers in a confined space with animals that do not like strangers." Jim was quiet for a long moment, then he started to smile. "Tom, you are not seriously considering." "I am not considering anything," I said. "I am just observing that bulls are territorial animals. They do not like loud noises or unfamiliar smells or crowds of people in their space, and they especially do not like it when someone tries to take over their home." "How would you even?" "The pen gate is held shut by a simple latch," I said, "and the path from the pen to the barn is clear and straight. If someone were to accidentally leave that gate open during a loud party, well, animals do what animals do." Jim stared at me for a long moment. "You know this is completely insane, right?" "Sometimes insane is the only response to insanity." That evening, I sat on my porch and watched the sun set behind the mountains. The air was still and quiet, broken only by the occasional snort or movement from the bull pen. I thought about my grandfather, who had built this ranch with his bare hands during the Depression. I thought about my father, who had expanded it and improved it and passed it down to me with pride. And I thought about Sheriff Corinne Blackwood, who thought she could just take it all away with a fake document and a badge. The plan was simple. Wait for the party to reach its peak. Wait for everyone to be distracted and drunk and feeling invincible. Then open the gate and let nature take its course. I was not going to hurt anyone. I was just going to give them a very memorable lesson about the difference between respect and fear, about the difference between legitimate authority and corrupt power, about what happens when you push a man too far on his own land. Saturday could not come fast enough. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect weather that makes you grateful to be alive. But I felt anything but grateful as I watched Sheriff Karen's advance team arrive at 11 a.m. to begin setting up for their party in my barn. This time, she brought a full crew: 4 deputies, 2 county employees, and a handful of volunteers who had been recruited to help transform my livestock barn into a venue for the police department's annual appreciation dinner. They unloaded trucks full of supplies, equipment, and decorations like they were setting up for a wedding. I stood at my kitchen window, drinking coffee and watching them work. They had tables, chairs, a professional sound system, strings of lights, and even a portable bar complete with a mirrored backdrop. This was not some casual get-together. This was a full-scale event that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. Deputy Martinez supervised the setup, directing volunteers where to place tables and how to arrange the seating. He avoided looking toward the house, probably knowing I was watching and feeling uncomfortable about the whole situation. He was a good kid, but he was following orders, and Sheriff Karen's orders were law in this county. By noon, they had transformed my barn into something I barely recognized. The concrete floor where my bulls usually stood was covered with rented carpet. White tablecloths draped over folding tables. Strings of lights hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow that would have been beautiful if it had not been in my barn without my permission. The sound system was the worst part. They had speakers mounted in every corner, wired to a central control booth that could probably be heard 3 counties away. When they tested the system, the feedback screech sent my bulls into a frenzy. Thunder charged the fence separating his pen from the barn, his massive body slamming into the wooden rails with a sound like thunder. "You need to keep those animals quiet," Sheriff Karen told me when she arrived at 2 p.m. to inspect the setup. "We cannot have them disturbing our guests." "They are disturbed because you have turned their home into a nightclub," I replied. "Bulls do not like loud noises or crowds of strangers." "Then maybe you should have thought of that before you decided to raise livestock so close to a community resource." The arrogance of that statement took my breath away. My barn was not a community resource. It was private property that she had stolen through intimidation and forged documents, but arguing with her would only make things worse. By 4 p.m., the guests were beginning to arrive. County commissioners, city council members, local business owners, and dozens of off-duty law enforcement officers from neighboring departments. They parked their cars all over my property, blocking my driveway, trampling my grass, and treating my land like it was a public park. I watched from my kitchen window as they filed into my barn, laughing and talking, completely oblivious to the fact that they were trespassing on private property. They were good people, most of them, just trying to show support for their local sheriff's department. They had no idea that their party was built on a foundation of corruption and lies. Sheriff Karen held court in the center of the barn, wearing a black cocktail dress and high heels that clicked against the concrete floor. She was the queen of her domain, accepting congratulations and praise from her subjects, basking in the glow of her stolen power. The music started at 5:30. Country music at first, then rock, then something that sounded like it belonged in a dance club. The bass pounded through the floor and walls, vibrating through my entire property. My bulls responded by packing frantically in their pen, snorting and bellowing with increasing agitation. Thunder was the worst. The massive bull charged the fence repeatedly, his eyes wild with rage and confusion. Storm and Rebel joined him, their combined weight making the wooden rails creak and bend. They knew something was wrong, could sense the invasion of their territory, but had no way to respond except through fury. By 6 p.m., the party was in full swing. The sound of laughter, conversation, and music filled the air. The smell of barbecue and alcohol drifted across my property. Everyone was having a wonderful time celebrating the heroes of law enforcement in a barn that did not belong to them. I put on my work boots and walked out to the bullpen. The animals were more agitated than I had ever seen them, their massive bodies moving restlessly, their eyes fixed on the source of the noise and commotion. They were ready to explode, held back only by wooden rails and wire fencing. I checked my watch. 6:15. The party was at its peak. The guests were relaxed and distracted, and Sheriff Karen was busy playing hostess to her adoring crowd. It was time to give them all a night they would never forget. I walked to the bullpen with steady hands and a heart that pounded like a war drum. The evening air was filled with the sound of laughter and music from the party, but all I could hear was the heavy breathing of 6 agitated bulls who were ready to reclaim their territory. Thunder stood at the front of the group, his massive head lowered, his eyes fixed on the barn where strangers had invaded his domain. At 2,500 pounds of pure muscle and fury, he was nature's perfect instrument of justice. Behind him, Storm, Rebel, Titan, Goliath, and King paced and snorted, their collective weight enough to flatten anything in their path. The gate latch was simple, a metal bar that slid through 2 brackets, held in place by a spring-loaded pin. I had opened it thousands of times to move the bulls between pastures, but never like this. Never with the intention of unleashing chaos on the people who had stolen my property. "Sorry about this, boys," I whispered to the bulls, "but sometimes a man has to take back what is his." I lifted the latch and stepped aside. Thunder was through the gate before it was fully open, his massive hooves thundering against the ground as he charged toward the barn. The other bulls followed in a stampede of muscle and fury, their combined weight shaking the earth beneath my feet. The first scream came from Deputy Thompson, who had stepped outside for a cigarette just as Thunder rounded the corner. The deputy took one look at 2,500 pounds of angry bull bearing down on him and dove behind a parked car, his cigarette flying into the darkness. Thunder did not slow down. He charged straight through the open barn doors like a freight train, his horns lowered and his eyes wild with territorial rage. The sound of his hooves on the concrete floor mixed with the crash of overturning tables and the screams of terrified party guests. Storm was right behind him, followed by Rebel, Titan, Goliath, and King. 6 bulls weighing over 2,000 pounds each, all of them furious at the invasion of their home, all of them ready to reclaim what was theirs. The chaos was immediate and total. Tables flew through the air like toys. Chairs scattered in every direction. The portable bar collapsed under the weight of Rebel's massive body, sending bottles of alcohol crashing to the floor. The sound system shrieked feedback as speakers were knocked over and cables were torn from their connections. Sheriff Karen's scream cut through the chaos like a knife. I saw her pressed against the far wall of the barn, her black dress torn, her face white with terror. All her authority, all her power, all her arrogance meant nothing to a bull that weighed more than her patrol car. "Get them out of here," she screamed at her deputies. "Shoot them, do something." But her deputies were too busy trying to save themselves. Deputy Martinez was hanging from the rafters like a scared cat. Deputy Thompson was still hiding behind the overturned bar. The other officers had crowded into the corners of the barn, pressing themselves against the walls as 6 enraged bulls claimed the center of the space. I walked calmly to the barn doors and slid them shut. The heavy wooden doors closed with a solid thud, trapping everyone inside with their consequences. The sound echoed across my property like the closing of a tomb. Thunder spun around at the sound, his massive head swiveling toward the closed doors. But instead of charging them, he seemed to calm down slightly. This was his barn now, his territory, his domain. The strangers were trapped inside with him, exactly where they belonged. Through the small windows, I could see the continued chaos inside. People huddled in corners while bulls wandered through the wreckage of their party. Overturned tables, scattered decorations, and broken glass covered the floor. The smell of spilled alcohol mixed with the scent of fear and the musky odor of angry livestock. Sheriff Karen was still pressed against the wall, her eyes wide with terror as Storm sniffed curiously at the remains of the sound system. All her threats about code violations and inspections seemed pretty meaningless now. Her badge was just a piece of metal. Her uniform was just fabric. Her authority was just an illusion that had been shattered by 6 bulls who did not care about human hierarchies. I sat down on an overturned bucket and waited. The bulls would calm down soon enough. They were not killers, just territorial animals who had been pushed too far. But the lesson had been delivered. The message was clear. This was my property, my barn, my land. And anyone who thought they could just take it from me had just learned otherwise. The sound of sirens in the distance told me that someone had managed to call for help. Fire trucks, ambulances, maybe even the state police were on their way. But they were too late to save Sheriff Karen's party, too late to preserve her dignity, too late to restore her stolen authority. The bulls had already taken care of that. The first fire truck arrived 20 minutes later, followed by 2 ambulances and 3 more patrol cars from neighboring counties. The volunteer firefighters took one look at the situation and called for backup. They had dealt with barn fires and car accidents and heart attacks, but none of them had ever responded to a call involving 6 angry bulls and a room full of trapped law enforcement officers. Sheriff Karen's radio calls for help had been increasingly frantic, first demanding immediate assistance, then pleading for someone to get the bulls away from the barn, finally reduced to whimpering about how she was trapped and needed rescue. The transformation from arrogant authority figure to helpless victim was complete. It took the firefighters another 30 minutes to figure out how to safely extract the party guests without getting trampled. They used the barn's side door, which the bulls had not noticed, and evacuated people one at a time while keeping the animals distracted with food. Sheriff Karen was among the last to be rescued. She emerged from the barn looking like she had been through a war zone. Her black dress was torn and dirty. Her hair was disheveled. Her face was streaked with tears and mascara. The woman who had walked into my barn like she owned it now looked like a scared child who had learned a very hard lesson about the difference between respect and fear. The paramedics checked everyone for injuries, but amazingly, no one had been seriously hurt. A few cuts from broken glass, some bruises from falling over furniture, and a lot of wounded pride, but nothing that required hospitalization. The bulls had been angry, not homicidal. By the time the last guest had been evacuated, word had spread through the county like wildfire. Cars lined the road outside my property as neighbors and curiosity seekers came to see the aftermath of Sheriff Karen's party. Some of them were there to gawk at the chaos. Others were there to show their support for what I had done. Jim Bradley was the first to approach me as I stood watching the cleanup. "Tom, that was either the craziest thing I have ever seen or the most brilliant. I am not sure which." "Maybe both," I replied. More neighbors arrived as the evening wore on. the Hendersons, who had been forced to host Sheriff Coren's fishing tournament, the Millers, who had been pressured into providing their pasture for her training exercises, the Johnsons, who had been coerced into feeding her deputies. One by one, they came forward with their own stories of abuse and intimidation. She told me she would have my liquor license revoked if I did not cater her events for free, said Mary Patterson, who owned the local diner. She threatened to have my trucking permits pulled if I did not provide free transportation for her department, added Pete Wilson, who ran the county's largest freight company. She made me give her free veterinary services by threatening to report me for imaginary violations, said Doc Stevens, the local veterinarian. The pattern was clear. Sheriff Coren had been running a protection racket, using her badge to extort goods and services from local businesses and property owners. She had turned law enforcement into legalized theft, and everyone had been too afraid to speak out. Until now. State investigators arrived the next morning to interview witnesses and examine the forged documents that Sheriff Coren had used to justify her seizure of my property. The FBI followed 2 days later when the extent of her corruption became clear. What had started as a property dispute had become a federal investigation into civil rights violations and abuse of power. Sheriff Corinne Blackwood was suspended pending investigation. Her deputies were reassigned to other departments. The county commissioner who had allegedly signed the fake documents was arrested for fraud. The entire corrupt system that had protected her began to crumble like a house of cards. My bulls, meanwhile, had returned to their normal routine. They grazed peacefully in their pasture, occasionally lifting their heads to watch the investigators and reporters who continued to visit my property. Thunder, the hero of the evening, seemed particularly pleased with himself, as if he knew he had struck a blow for justice. 3 months later, Sheriff Corinne Blackwood stood in federal court wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of her uniform. The charges against her included civil rights violations, extortion, fraud, and conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming. Forged documents, coerced testimony, financial records showing payments from local businesses that should have been free, and testimony from dozens of victims who had finally found the courage to speak out. The judge was not sympathetic. "You took an oath to serve and protect the citizens of this county," he said during sentencing. "Instead, you used your position to terrorize and exploit them. Your actions have brought shame to every honest law enforcement officer in this country." Corinne received 8 years in federal prison. Her accomplices received shorter sentences, but their careers in law enforcement were over. The corrupt system that had protected her was dismantled and rebuilt with new oversight and accountability measures. The investigation had revealed the full extent of her crimes. She had extorted over $200,000 in goods and services from local businesses. She had falsified police reports to cover up her activities. She had intimidated witnesses and threatened anyone who dared to challenge her authority. But the real victory was not in the courthouse. It was in the transformation of our community. People who had been afraid to speak out for years suddenly found their voices. Business owners who had been forced to pay tribute to a corrupt sheriff could finally operate freely. Property owners who had lived in fear of arbitrary code enforcement could sleep peacefully at night. The new sheriff, elected in a special election, was a local man named Dave Thompson. He had grown up in the county, understood the community, and believed in the radical idea that law enforcement should actually serve the people rather than prey on them. His first official act was to publicly apologize for the crimes committed by his predecessor, and to promise that such abuse would never happen again. My barn became something of a local landmark. Tour buses would drive by slowly, while guides told the story of the night 6 bulls took on a corrupt sheriff and won. The media attention was overwhelming at first, but it eventually died down as new stories replaced old ones. I was grateful for the return to privacy. The bulls, meanwhile, had become celebrities in their own right. Thunder was featured on the cover of a national magazine as the bull who brought down a sheriff. Animal rights activists praised them as heroes. Ranchers from across the country sent letters of support and admiration. But to me, they were just my bulls. The same animals I had raised from calves, the same creatures I fed and watered and cared for every day. They had simply done what bulls do when their territory is threatened. They had defended their home. The barn itself required some repairs after the party. Broken lights, damaged walls, and a floor that needed to be refinished. But I was happy to do the work. Every nail I drove and every board I replaced was a reminder of the night I took back what was mine. On quiet evenings, I would sit on my porch and watch the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The same mountains my grandfather had looked at when he first settled this land. The same sky my father had admired when he expanded the ranch and built it into something to be proud of. This was still my sanctuary, my peace, my reward for a lifetime of hard work, but now it was something more. It was a symbol of what happens when ordinary people find the courage to stand up to corruption, when honest citizens refuse to be bullied by those who abuse their power, when justice comes not from courtrooms and lawyers, but from the hearts of people who know right from wrong. The bulls grazed peacefully in their pasture, occasionally lifting their heads to watch the cars that still drove by to see the famous barn. Thunder, now legendary throughout the county, seemed to enjoy the attention. He would pose for photographs and accept treats from visitors who came to pay their respects to the animal who had changed everything. As the sun set behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. Sometimes the system fails. Sometimes the law protects the lawbreakers. Sometimes ordinary people have to take extraordinary measures to set things right. And sometimes justice comes with hooves.